In 1982, a United States congressional hearing on narcotics released a report about a gang operating in Detroit. The report described the gang's street-level workers as, and this is a direct quote, gun-carrying criminals who will kill to protect their individual street corners. Nothing unusual about that. Every major city had gangs. Every gang had soldiers willing to kill. But then the report mentioned something that made the room go quiet. The youngest workers were 8 years old. Not 18, 8. Third graders. Kids who still believed in Santa Claus. Kids who should have been learning multiplication tables and riding bicycles to school. Instead, they were carrying product in their backpacks, delivering it on 10-speed bikes, and working shifts on elementary school playgrounds. The same playgrounds where other children were jumping rope. And here's the part that nobody could believe. The jump rope rhymes had changed. Detroit children, not the dealers, just regular kids in the neighborhood, were singing songs about the gang's product brands. Atomic Dog, Murder One, P-Funk, Purple Haze. They turned a criminal empire into a nursery rhyme. The gang was called Young Boys Incorporated, and at its peak, the United States Senate called it the most sophisticated black criminal organization in America outside of the Italian mafia. They made $300,000 a day. They controlled 90% of Detroit's product trade. They had a corporate structure that federal agents compared to a Fortune 500 company. And the chief executive officer of this empire, the man who built the entire system, was a convicted killer from Detroit's west side with a fourth-grade education level and a genius-level understanding of one thing. Children can't be prosecuted as adults. Detroit in the mid-1970s was a city eating itself alive. The auto industry was bleeding jobs. White flight had hollowed out entire neighborhoods. The tax base was collapsing. And into the vacuum came the same thing that always fills a vacuum: money that does not come with a W-2 form. The west side of Detroit, around Dexter, Monterey, and Linwood Avenues, was ground zero. This was where the product trade lived, where corners changed hands like currency, where a teenager with ambition and no fear could become a millionaire before he was old enough to vote. 4 young men from this neighborhood would build something that had never existed before. Raymond Peoples, known as Baby Ray, was the smooth talker, the deal maker, the one who could walk into a room and walk out with a connection. Dwayne Davis, known as Wonderful Wayne, WW, was the hustler, the one who understood volume and velocity. Mark Marshall, called Block, was the muscle, cold, violent, the one you did not want to see coming. And then there was the fourth one, the one who came home from prison in February 1978 with a 4-year sentence for manslaughter behind him and a vision for something nobody in Detroit had ever seen. His name was Milton Jones. The streets called him Butch. Before Butch Jones, every black dealer in Detroit bought their supply from the same source, the Italian mafia. La Cosa Nostra controlled wholesale on the East Coast and in the Midwest. If you wanted product, you went through them. They set the price, they set the terms, and they took a cut of everything. Butch Jones looked at that system and saw a chain around his neck. His first move was independence. He convinced Baby Ray, Block, and WW to cut ties with the Italians entirely. Instead, they connected with a man named John Milwaukee Jack Mays, a former lieutenant of Henry Marzette, the legendary Detroit cop turned kingpin who had built his own empire years earlier. Through Mays, Butch found Sylvester Seal Murray, a supplier who could get product from the Golden Triangle, the border region between Laos, Thailand, and Myanmar. This was the same pipeline that had fed the heroin trade during the Vietnam War. Now, it was feeding Detroit. With an independent supply line secured, Butch needed one more thing. He needed a distribution network that the police could not touch. That was when he had the idea that changed everything. The problem with street dealing was simple. Adults get arrested. Adults get charged. Adults go to prison. And every time you lose a dealer, you lose a corner. You lose revenue. You lose territory. But children under a certain age could not be prosecuted as adults. If a 10-year-old got caught with product, the worst that happened was a trip to juvenile hall and a release back to his mother the same day. The corner never went dark. The money never stopped flowing. Butch Jones recruited boys and girls between the ages of 8 and 12. He put them on elementary school playgrounds. He gave them product to sell in $10 and $25 packages. He had them deliver orders on 10-speed bicycles and in taxi cabs paid for by the organization. Think about that for a second. A taxi pulls up to a corner in Detroit. An 8-year-old gets out. He is carrying a backpack. Inside that backpack is enough product to put an adult in prison for 20 years. But the child? The child goes home to his mother by dinner. These were not random kids off the street. They were recruited, trained, managed, given specific corners, given specific hours, given specific prices, and paid. Well, a kid working a shift for YB, I could make more in an afternoon than his mother made in a week. Some of these children were earning hundreds of dollars a day. In neighborhoods where a family might survive on a few hundred a month, that kind of money was transformative. The children had a structure too. The youngest ones, 8, 9, 10, were runners and lookouts. They moved product from stash houses to corners. They watched for police. They signaled when it was safe. The older ones, 11 and 12, handled the actual sales. And the oldest teenagers moved up into enforcement roles. For children growing up in neighborhoods where poverty was the only inheritance, Young Boys Incorporated was not just a gang. It was a job, a career, a path. Being a member was, according to a congressional report, a status symbol for black youth in Detroit. The report even quoted authorities saying if you asked an inner-city black youth what he wanted to be when he grew up, do not be surprised if he says a major drug dealer. And that was the most devastating part of the whole operation. Butch Jones did not just exploit children. He made them want to be exploited. Young Boys Incorporated was not a street gang. It was a business. Butch Jones built the organization like a Fortune 500 company. Every role was defined. Every function had a chain of command. Federal agents who studied the operation described it as a military-like organization chart for narcotics conspiracy. At the top were the 4 founders. Butch and Block oversaw daily operations and ran an enforcement unit called the Wrecking Crew. Baby Ray and Wonderful Wayne each commanded their own crews and operated with autonomy, deferring to Butch only for major decisions and disputes. Below the founders was an enforcement crew called the A-Team, led by a teenage hitman named Curtis Kurt McGurk Napier. Napier was so violent, so feared, that the city of Detroit labeled him Public Enemy Number 1. He was 19 years old. Below the A-Team was the finance and supply crew led by Seal Murray. And below all of them, the most critical layer, were the children, the 8 to 12-year-olds who moved the product on the street, the engine of the entire machine. The operation also had rules. No member of the crew was allowed to use the product they sold. Butch Jones was strict about this. He had seen what addiction did to other organizations. It made people sloppy. It made people steal. It made people snitch. His workers stayed clean. He also branded his product. Each batch had a name: Atomic Dog, Murder One, P-Funk, Purple Haze. These were not random labels. They were marketing. Butch tested each batch with known users who could vouch for the quality before it hit the streets. If the product was good, the name spread. And in Detroit's neighborhoods, the name spread so far that children who had nothing to do with Young Boys Incorporated were singing them in jump rope rhymes on the sidewalk. A criminal empire had become a children's song. By 1982, the numbers were staggering. Federal authorities estimated that Young Boys Incorporated cleared close to $500 million in a single calendar year. That is not a typo. $500 million from a gang whose youngest workers had not finished elementary school. Daily revenue was estimated at $300,000. They controlled an estimated 90% of Detroit's product trade. The United States Senate, in a subcommittee report on organized crime, called Young Boys Incorporated one of the most sophisticated, corporate-like, structured, organized crime groups outside of the Italian mafia. A Senate subcommittee compared a Detroit street gang run by a convicted killer to the Gambinos, to the Genovese, to the organizations that had been running American crime for half a century. And they said Young Boys Incorporated was their equal. That comparison was not about violence. It was about structure, about discipline, about the ability to move product across an entire city with the efficiency of a supply chain and the secrecy of a shadow. Butch Jones had a manslaughter conviction and no college degree. What he had was an understanding of systems. He understood that a gang is just a bad company, disorganized, emotional, and easy to dismantle. A corporation is something else entirely. A corporation survives the loss of any individual employee. A corporation has redundancy. A corporation has protocol. And a corporation that uses children as its frontline workforce has a legal shield that no adult operation can match. Here is a detail that almost nobody talks about. Young Boys Incorporated did not emerge from nothing. It was built on the bones of a previous empire. Henry Marzette was a Detroit police officer who became one of the city's biggest kingpins. He used his badge to build a product distribution network that operated under the protection of the police department itself. When Marzette's empire eventually fell, his lieutenants scattered. One of those lieutenants was John Mays, known as Milwaukee Jack. Mays became Young Boys Incorporated's first primary supplier. Through Mays, Butch Jones inherited the connections, the supply lines, and the institutional knowledge of an operation that had been running for years before YBI existed. He did not have to build everything from scratch. He plugged into an existing infrastructure and then improved it. Mays then introduced Butch to a man who would become even more critical, Sylvester Murray, known as Seal. Murray was the largest black product wholesaler in Michigan and one of the biggest in the entire Midwest. His supply came from the Golden Triangle, the border region where Laos, Thailand, and Myanmar meet. This was the same pipeline that American soldiers had discovered during the Vietnam War, the same route that had flooded American cities with product throughout the 1970s. Murray did not work on street corners. He worked in bulk. He moved weight through a network of intermediaries that stretched from Southeast Asia to the ports of the West Coast, to warehouses in the Midwest, and finally to Detroit. By the time the product reached Butch Jones, it had already traveled 10,000 miles. And Butch broke it down, branded it, and handed it to 8-year-olds on bicycles. The DEA and the Detroit Police Department eventually seized many of Murray's properties in 1983. Murray was referred to as S-Man by Butch Jones, always congenially, always with respect, because without Murray's pipeline, there was no YBI. Without Marzette's lieutenant making the introduction, there was no Murray. Without Marzette himself building the original infrastructure, there was no introduction. This is the lineage of Detroit's underworld. Marzette built the foundation. Mays carried the knowledge. Murray provided the supply. Butch Jones applied the innovation. The cop-turned-kingpin's empire did not die when Marzette went down. It evolved. It got younger, and it got more ruthless. Not everything about YBI was corporate efficiency and branded products. There was blood. Plenty of it. The wrecking crew was Butch Jones's enforcement arm. Their job was simple. Make sure nobody left, nobody talked, and nobody competed. If you worked for YBI, you could not just quit. You could not walk away. You could not decide one morning that you wanted to go back to school or get a regular job. The wrecking crew made sure that leaving the organization came with consequences that nobody wanted to face. This was not a suggestion. It was a rule enforced with violence. The only way out of YBI was to leave Detroit entirely, and even then the wrecking crew had been known to follow. And if you were a competitor, if you tried to sell on YBI territory without permission. The response was immediate and permanent. Butch Jones did not tolerate competition. Rivals were eliminated. Their corners were absorbed. Their workers were given a choice: join YBI or join the rival in the ground. Their customers became YBI customers overnight. The face of this violence was a teenager named Curtis Napier. The streets called him Kurt McGurk. At 19 years old, he was the leader of the A-Team, YBI's enforcement squad, and the most feared person in Detroit. Not the most feared teenager, the most feared person. The city of Detroit officially labeled him public enemy #1. Think about that. A city of over 1 million people, organized crime families that had operated for decades, violent gangs on every corner, and the person the police feared most was a 19-year-old kid who worked for a gang run by another kid's idea. When the walls started closing in on YBI, Napier did not hide. He did not run. He went on a final rampage through the city, collecting every unpaid debt, administering beatings to anyone who owed the organization, sending a message that even if YBI was going down, nobody was getting away clean. He tore through Detroit like a one-man wrecking crew. The police finally caught him after a high-speed chase in a stolen car. He was captured, tried, and sentenced to life in prison. He was 19 years old. Butch Jones himself admitted in his autobiography, which he self-published in 1996, that he committed his first killing at 15 years old. He described being hired to kill a man and emptying an entire clip into the man's back. He wrote about it with a matter-of-fact tone that was almost more disturbing than the act itself. No remorse, no drama, just a description of work done. First, 15 years old, emptied the clip. That's who built this empire. By late 1980, the empire was fracturing from the inside. The problem was not the police, and it was not the feds, and it was not a rival gang. It was the same thing that has destroyed every empire since the beginning of time. The men at the top turned on each other. Baby Ray Peoples and Block Marshall, two of the 4 founders, had a falling out over a woman. They were both seeing the same person, and the tension that had been simmering for months boiled over into something that could not be taken back. Baby Ray, the smooth talker, the deal maker, the one everyone thought was too cool for violence, shot Block Marshall. Block survived, but the message was clear. The brotherhood was broken. Block packed up and left Detroit for California. He never came back. One of the 4 founding pillars of a $500 million empire, gone because of a woman. Around the same time, Wonderful Wayne began to chafe under Butch Jones's increasingly heavy-handed leadership. Butch ran the organization with an iron fist. The wrecking crew answered to him. The rules were his rules, and if you questioned those rules, even if you were a founder, Butch took it as a challenge. Wayne started pulling away. He stopped attending meetings. He stopped deferring to Butch on decisions. The distance between them grew wider every week. Two men who had built something together from nothing were now circling each other like enemies. And then came the most devastating blow of all. Dwayne "Wonderful" Wayne Davis was shot and killed. One of the four original founders, the man who had been there from the very beginning, who had helped build the operation from a corner of Dexter and Linwood into a $500 million machine, was dead. The news rippled through every corner that YBI controlled. The soldiers heard it. The children heard it. The suppliers heard it. If the founders could kill each other, nobody was safe. Of the original four, Butch was heading to prison. Block was in California. Wayne was dead. Baby Ray was exposed. The foundation had cracked in 4 different places at once. The organization that had been built to run like a corporation was being torn apart by the same thing that destroys every empire, the egos and emotions of the men at the top. You can build the most sophisticated system in the world. You can recruit 300 workers. You can generate $500 million a year. But you cannot remove the human weakness of the men who run it. And human weakness always wins. In 1982, the federal government moved. Raymond "Baby Ray" Peoples, Butch Jones, and 41 lieutenants were indicted on racketeering and narcotics charges. The net was wide. The evidence was deep. Wiretaps, surveillance, cooperating witnesses, financial records that traced the money from the street corners to the supply chain to the Golden Triangle. The indictment named the children, not by name, but by age. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Federal prosecutors laid out in court documents how an organization had systematically recruited minors to do the work that adults would go to prison for. Butch Jones was convicted and sentenced to federal prison. He served 12 years. But the first wave of indictments was just the beginning. In 1987, a second wave hit, and this time the names on the indictment were even more shocking. W. Otis Culpepper was a well-known Detroit attorney. He was famous locally for defending accused criminals and murder defendants. He was supposed to be on the side of the law. Instead, according to the indictment, Butch Jones had been paying Culpepper with cash, product, properties, and vehicles, including a 1976 Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow. A defense attorney driving a Rolls-Royce given to him by the leader of a gang that used children as street dealers. That is what YBBI had become. But it was not just lawyers. The corruption reached into law enforcement itself. Retired Highland Park police officer Ralph Jackson was charged with racketeering and filing false income tax returns connected to YBI. A cop on YBI's payroll, former Deputy Wayne County Sheriff Henry Duvall was indicted on racketeering charges for embezzling $2,000 in bail money deposited at the Wayne County Jail. A deputy sheriff stealing bail money for a gang run by a man who recruited 8-year-olds. The indictments painted a picture of an organization that had not just infected the streets. It had infected the institutions, the lawyers, the police, the sheriff's department. YBI's money had seeped into every crack in Detroit's system. And Young Boys Incorporated's downfall created something worse than what it replaced. When Young Boys Incorporated fell, Detroit did not get safer. It got more violent. The vacuum left by Young Boys Incorporated was filled by a new generation of organizations: the Chambers Brothers, Maserati Rick, the Curry Brothers, Pony Down, Best Friends. And these new crews did not sell heroin, they sold crack. The crack epidemic hit Detroit like a nuclear bomb. The organizational discipline that Butch Jones had demanded, no using, no stealing, no freelancing, disappeared with him. The new crews were more violent, less structured, and more desperate. The Chambers brothers were making $1 million a day, but using time cards for their workers. Maserati Rick was buying luxury cars with cash and getting photographed in them. They were flashy where Butch had been strategic. They were reckless where YBI had been disciplined. And the body count exploded. Detroit's murder rate in the late 1980s was among the highest in the nation. The city earned the nickname Murder City. The Devil's Night arsons. Entire blocks burning. Federal authorities later acknowledged an uncomfortable truth. The takedown of Young Boys Incorporated, while necessary, may have accelerated the violence that consumed Detroit in the late 1980s. The structure was evil, but the absence of structure was worse. Butch Jones served his 12 years and was released from federal prison. And then he went right back. He was arrested again on murder and drug charges. Convicted again, sentenced again. The man who had built the most sophisticated drug operation in Detroit history could not stay away from the only world he knew. But Butch was not the only founder who tried to come back. Baby Ray Peoples also attempted to reestablish himself in Detroit's underworld after his release. But the city had changed. The players were different. The product was different. The rules were different. The crack era had created a new generation of dealers who did not respect the old guard. Baby Ray's name still carried weight on certain blocks, but weight is not power. The streets had moved on. Meanwhile, the YBI model, using youth as runners and dealers, did not die with the organization. It spread. Other gangs in Detroit adopted the same playbook. And then gangs in other cities adopted it too. The idea that children could be used as a legal shield was not unique to YBI anymore. It had become standard operating procedure in the American product trade. A former YBI member named Darryl Terrell resurfaced decades later in 2017. 35 years after the original federal takedown, Terrell had built a new cocaine empire, this time involving his relatives, a grandmotherly figure used as a mule, and a soul food restaurant as a front. Federal authorities said he had applied the same sophisticated organizational methods he learned in YBI to his new operation. The ghost of YBI was still running corners in Detroit 35 years after the indictments. As of his last public filing, Butch Jones was serving time at a federal medical prison in Springfield, Missouri, with a projected release date of 2027. He petitioned for compassionate release during COVID, citing his deteriorating health. The petition was denied. He is in his mid-60s now. He has spent more of his life in prison than out of it. The man who built the most sophisticated black criminal organization in Detroit history, the man the Senate compared to the Italian mafia, has been locked in a federal cell for most of his adult life. His autobiography, self-published in 1996, tells his version of the story. In it, he describes YBI as a response to poverty, a product of circumstance, a system built by people who had no other system available to them. The federal government saw it differently. They saw an organization that recruited children. It turned playgrounds into distribution centers. It made 8-year-olds carry product so adults could avoid prosecution. It corrupted lawyers, cops, and deputy sheriffs. It generated $500 million in a single year on the backs of children who could not spell the names of the substances they were selling. One detail stays with you longer than the money, longer than the violence, longer than the indictments. Jump rope rhymes. Children in Detroit, not Young Boys Incorporated members, but just kids in the neighborhood, were singing songs about product brands on their sidewalks. They chanted brand names: Atomic Dog, Murder One, P-Funk, Purple Haze. They did not know what they were singing about. They were 8 years old. They were 9 years old. They were jumping rope, clapping hands, and turning in circles while they chanted the names of substances that were killing their neighbors. That is what Young Boys Incorporated did to Detroit. It did not just build a drug empire, it embedded itself in the culture so deeply that children absorbed it the way children absorb everything, through play, through song, through repetition. The children who jumped rope to those rhymes are adults now. They are in their 40s and 50s. Some have children of their own. Some are grandparents. And some of them, the ones who were recruited at 8 or 9 or 10 years old, the ones who carried product in their backpacks and delivered it on bicycles, never made it to adulthood at all. Nobody kept count of the children who were lost, not the ones who were killed in the crossfire of territorial disputes, not the ones who were arrested and cycled through a juvenile system that did not know what to do with them, not the ones who aged into the crack era and became the very customers that the next generation of dealers exploited. The federal indictments counted 41 lieutenants. They never counted the children. By the time the federal government took Young Boys Incorporated down, the damage was already permanent. A generation of children had been recruited as soldiers. Another generation had been raised on the rhymes. And Detroit was left with a wound that has not healed in 40 years. $500 million in a single year. $300,000 a day. 90% of a city's product trade. The United States Senate's stamp as the most sophisticated black crime organization in America. A corrupt attorney driving a Rolls-Royce. A corrupt cop on the payroll. A corrupt deputy sheriff stealing bail money. A teenage hitman labeled public enemy number 1 before his 20th birthday. 4 founders who built an empire and destroyed each other. All of it built on the backs of children who should have been in the 3rd grade. That is the legacy of Young Boys Incorporated. Not the money, not the power, not the founders, the jump rope rhymes.